Leith Van Onselen, we're very fortunate to have him from macrobusiness.com.au and the chief economist at the MB Fund and MB Super. He joins us every week, myself or Luke, for the Treasury of Common Sense. Leith is on the line. Hello, mate.
G'day, Trent. How's things?
Really well, mate. Really well. Now, data centres are going to drive up energy, water and construction costs, which surprises not yourself or anybody who's thought about this, I would have thought.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is particularly pertinent if you live in Sydney, because Sydney's going to be the epicentre of the data investment boom, and alongside Melbourne, but Sydney's basically the number one spot in Australia that is receiving this massive data centre investment. And I'm sure everyone listening to this has heard about this data centre. You know, it's all the rage now. It's going to save the Australian economy. It's going to be the next mining boom. It's going to create all these jobs, you know, in the construction process, blah, blah, blah. We've all heard it. But the CBA economics team, they actually released some interesting analysis this week on the data centre construction boom. And they estimated that there's around 6 gigawatts of potential capacity in Australia's pipeline. Now, that doesn't mean much to everybody because, you know, what's a gigawatt, right?
Yeah, exactly.
What they found is that there's a huge boom, huge pipeline, again, concentrated in New South Wales, particularly Sydney. Also, you know, secondaries, Melbourne, and it's sort of spreading to the other capitals as well. And CBA forecasts that this construction boom is going to add about 0.2% to Australia's GDP growth over 2026 and 27. So, you know, big deal. It's going to add a little bit to economic growth. I don't particularly really care, to be honest with you, and I'm sure most people don't. but what CBA did find is that it's going to have a significant impact on energy costs and energy demand, water demand and water costs, as well as construction costs across Australia. That obviously does impact us all directly. And what CBA found was that data centres currently account for about 2% of Australia's electricity consumption. Well, that was as of the 2025 financial year. So,
Okay.
you know, about 18 months ago, well, just over a year old. But, you know, they counted for about 2% of Australia's total electricity consumption. So it's not a huge amount, but it's still significant. But this is forecast to grow to more than 6% by 2031. So in about 5 years' time, it's going to be about 6% of total electricity consumption. And then in a decade, in 2036, it's forecast to be 9% of Australia's electricity consumption. So nearly... Yeah, which is a lot. So basically 1/11 of Australia's total electricity consumption is going to be in data centres, which is obviously a concern given that, you know, we have shortages of energy and we've got incoming shortages, which I'll talk about in a second. But data centres also expected to be significant consumers of water, especially for Sydney, because data centres use water to basically cool their servers and that sort of thing, and they're quite significant consumers of our residential water supply. And Sydney Water estimates that data centre demand could reach around 15 to 20% of current Sydney water supply, greater Sydney water supply. So that is very significant.
Yeah, that is.
Nearly, you know, it's a lot. So it's basically 1/6 to 1/5 of current Sydney water supply could be taken up by data centres, which is quite concerning. And CBA also warned that data centre investment, so because it's such a massive investment boom and they're building all these things right across the country, but particularly in Sydney and Melbourne, it's likely to drive up construction costs for everything, because all this extra demand is going to need tradies, it's going to need materials, it's going to need all this sort of stuff. So it's going to basically drive up total construction costs, and that's going to put at risk other national infrastructure priorities. So, for example, housing. So, you know, Labor the Albanese government obviously set these lofty housing supply targets where they want to build 1.2 million homes over 5 years, which, as I mentioned last week, they're tracking way behind. In the first 21 months, already tracking about 112,000 homes, or about 27% behind the targets. But data centres, all this extra construction costs from the data centre demand is likely to make meeting those housing targets even harder.
Of course.
Which is obviously a concern given the government keeps running the mass migration program, which keeps bringing more people in, and we can't build enough infrastructure and housing and all these other stuff for all the people they're bringing in. Data centres is just likely to exacerbate that problem. Now, the biggest risk I see, Trent, is that this data centre boom is forecast to coincide with other factors that are going to massively increase the demand for electricity in Australia. So as I mentioned, data centres forecast to consume about 9% of Australia's electricity in 10 years. On top of that, the official projections from the government are that the population is going to grow by 13 million, or about nearly 50% over the next 40 years. So obviously, all these extra people an extra Sydney, Melbourne and Perth, roughly, worth of people are going to need extra electricity, obviously.
Yeah.
The government also wants to completely electrify the vehicle fleet. So, you know, all the millions of vehicles in Australia are supposed to go from petrol and diesel to electric over the coming decades. Well, that's going to massively increase electricity demand. And then because we're going to have all these extra people, like, you know, an extra 13 million over the next 40 years, plus data centres needing water, well, we're going to have to build a whole bunch of water desalination plants. And they use a lot of energy as well. So what this basically tells you is that Australia is facing a monstrous increase in demand for electricity to meet all these things, at the same time as our idiotic government has committed to closing down the nation's baseload, non-weather dependent coal generation in favour of wind and solar backed by storage. Now, by 2035, so, you know, roughly a decade, where Australia's scheduled to shut down basically 3/4 of its coal generation, electricity generation, and by 2040, nearly all of it is scheduled to shut down, right? So how is Australia going to power data centres, the electrification of the vehicle fleet, the massive growth in the population, all these new water desalination plants that will need to be built, and just the general economy, when we're going to shut down our only stable 24/7 supply of electricity, which comes from coal, in favour of things that we cannot control, which is basically wind and solar? Because this winter has shown us that we can have wind droughts that hit the entire east coast of Australia for days on end.
Yeah.
Where basically all our windmills that we're spending, all the billions of dollars we're spending on wind turbines and everything, basically produce no power for long periods. And obviously the sun, especially in winter, we've got shorter days, especially down south. But, you know, the sun only shines for a fixed portion of the day. Yet data centres need 24/7 power, and indeed the economy needs 24/7 power. So this, to me, just is the main problem I've got with this whole data centre boom and this whole notion that we can electrify everything in this country, because the government wants to shut down basically the only source of 24/7 stable power that we have. And Trent, this comes at the same time as Australia is the biggest coal exporter in the world.
Of course.
And we sell that coal to Asia, which accounts for more than 70% of the world's coal consumption and 60% of the world's carbon emissions.
Let them burn it, but we won't do it here.
Yeah, that's right. So we're effectively banning Australians from burning coal, which is basically the government's plan over the next decade, is to ban us from burning coal. At the same, to meet this net zero goal when we're 1% of the world's carbon emissions, at the same time as we are exporting orders of magnitude more coal to Asia to burn instead of us. And Asia's growing its coal consumption every single year. So, you know, in my view, Australia should just copy China and India and place our energy and industrial security first, because both China and India are massively ramping up their coal to chemicals industry. So they're basically, what they're doing at the moment is they're building these new industries around basically burning coal to create chemicals like urea and other fertilizers and things like that, which is massively increasing their coal use. But doing that actually emits more emissions than simply burning coal to produce electricity.
Yeah.
So how is it that our government is happy to sell coal to all these countries to basically burn it for electricity or to use it to make chemicals or synthetic diesel and all these other things, while at the same time our government wants us to basically wean off completely and not burn our own resources, and then they expect to build data centres everywhere that need reliable 24/7 power. They want to electrify the entire vehicle fleet. They want to grow the population by nearly 50% over the next 40 years. And then we're going to need to build a whole bunch of desalination plants, which require tons of energy as well. This whole equation that the government has set up for us around all these things, data centres and everything else, just does not make sense. And I'd argue, Trent, that we'd be better off burning coal in Australia in a cleaner, more modern coal plant like Japan has, if we built some new ones, than sending it overseas to be burned in a less clean manner that actually increase emissions and pollution. But unfortunately, because of our net zero zealotry and the government's blinkers on this issue, they seem to think that we can just run the entire economy on intermittent power that we have zero control over.
Just blunder our way through it.
Yeah, it's just this whole thing doesn't make sense.
Not at all, mate. Thank you so much for your time, Leith. You'll speak to Luke again next week, and I appreciate your time over the last couple of weeks, mate.
Yeah, no worries, Trent. Anytime.